Madam Chair. Can I start by declaring an interest? I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a trades unionist and I have strong links to the transport unions, particularly Unite, RMT and ASLEF. And indeed, as I did point out at second reading, my first job many years ago when I was a young fella was on the railways when they were part of British Rail. And in those days I was a member of the National Union of Railwaymen. And more recently, I've also served on the Transport Select Committee for almost 6 years, and I'm delighted that many of the arguments and issues raised by myself and many other stakeholders raised in numerous sessions have finally found their way into a government bill and onto the floor of the House of Commons. I understand the opposition's call for reports in their amendments, performance assessments, impact assessments. Having served 14 years in opposition, Madam Chair, I'm familiar with the arguments. However, I think that the integrity of this bill must remain intact, and much of the information requested by the opposition will be produced routinely in relation to performance without the need for a separate clause to the bill. I want to thank my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport and her team for prioritising this bill and bringing it back to the House so soon after the recess, continuing the momentum from before the summer. I believe the bill will fix a structural failure within UK railways by ending the presumption in favour of the private sector for passenger service delivery. Contrary to the views expressed by the opposition and set out quite eloquently by their Shadow Secretary of State, this bill will actually save taxpayers money, with profits used instead to improve rail services rather than inflating the considerable and unwarranted dividend payments to private train operators. And as my right honourable friend indicated, most often these private train operating companies are owned by foreign governments, and what we are doing in fact is subsidising the rail fares of passengers in other European countries. The previous government allowed train operating companies to pay out hundreds of millions in dividends while taking public subsidies. This is financial mismanagement. It's bad value for money. It's exploitative towards the taxpayer and to commuters. I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to my friend for giving way. The privatisation of the railway was a privatisation too far for even she whose portrait should be removed. But does my honourable friend agree with me that it's utterly ridiculous that the only nation state on the planet not being able to run the railway in this country is this one?
Absolutely, and if ever there was a charge of political dogma, that must be it. The fact that the British taxpayer and the British government are not allowed, under the terms of the privatisation, to own a stake in our own railway. And for too long, private companies have provided a substandard service while making substantial profits. Over the last 7 years, the remaining private train operating companies, I do apologise earlier, Madam Chairman, I said 14. There are 14 in total, 4 of which are currently provided by the state through the operator of last resort. So I did misspeak earlier. I apologise for misleading the House on that. But over the last 7 years, the train operating companies have paid out an average of £130 million annually to their shareholders. And often the shareholders, these are often companies that are owned by foreign governments in Germany and Italy and France and across Europe and the world, while passengers' day-to-day experience has been of overcrowded carriages, delays, service failure, and worst of all, some of the highest fares in Europe. And it's worth thinking about the costs and the profits that some of the private train operators have been able to generate to shareholders. And figures released just this week, Madam Chairman, show that Govia Thameslink Railways paid out a staggering £82.4 million in dividends, with £62.3 million of this being for the 2023-2024 financial year, and that represents a 268% increase from the previous year. Now, in return for these princely profits, Govia consistently failed to meet 2/3 of its customer service quality targets, or so it was reported in the Financial Times. This situation was encouraged to persist under the last Conservative government, and I welcome the fact that Labour is making this a priority from day one. This is fundamental to fixing the foundations and delivering the economic growth that was promised by the Prime Minister. I do want to support some of the comments that were made by my honourable friend, the member for Derby North, and the honourable gentleman, the member for Moray West, Nairn and Strathpay, and that's in relation to the rolling stock companies, the so-called Roscoes. Many commentators see a problem with the newly formed Great British Railways having to continue to lease rolling stock from Roscoes. This would allow these companies to profit from taxpayers' money. It's also my view Roscoes are an unnecessary link in the chain. I frequently raise this issue with experts and industry leaders on the Transport Select Committee, and I believe we would benefit from meeting our rolling stock needs by placing orders directly with UK-based manufacturers like Alstom and Hitachi, rather than enriching the Roscoes. I appreciate that the Secretary of State has made a strong start with this bill, despite being in post for a relatively short time. However, I must urge her to consider the points that have been raised by myself and other members on both sides of the House about how we continue to procure rolling stock as we move forward. At the second reading debate, the Rail Minister stated that purchasing existing rolling stock would not be a responsible use of taxpayers' money. I understand that. But can the Minister clarify, when responding, whether there will be an option to directly purchase new rolling stock in the future under GBR, instead of having to continue to lease them through the Roscoes? As my honourable friend said, the UK needs to upgrade to 4,000 units of rolling stock over the coming decades, with Network Rail estimating costs in the tens of billions. This is an ideal opportunity to explore a new financing model for rolling stock. I'm not naive, I understand the financial situation we've inherited from the last government, but I ask the government to explore the not-for-profit financiers if rolling stock cannot be nationalised under GBR. And can I point out respectfully, Eurofirma, which is a supranational not-for-profit financier, they state that for every £1 billion in finance to UK railways, it could potentially save the taxpayer £350 million over 30 years due to lower financing costs. That's compared to using the existing Roscoes. So will the Secretary of State update us on the possibility of using not-for-profit financiers for rolling stock in preference to the Roscoes? I did want to take up the point that the Shadow Secretary of State made about the peer review bodies. And can I just point out, Madam Chair, that they're not universally welcomed. I was just looking about some of the responses about peer review bodies in the health service, and the last government has a less than wonderful record in relation to implementing the recommendations of peer review bodies, not least for the junior doctors. But the nurses, the Royal College of Nurses said of peer review bodies, there's nothing independent about them. The chairs and members of peer review bodies are handpicked by the Prime Minister and government ministers, and the terms of reference are decided by the government. I think there's some scepticism abroad about how truly independent they are, and then when they do make recommendations, whether or not the government are obligated to implement those in full. So I would like to ask our own front bench if it is possible to provide a timetable for the next steps, including when future bills will be introduced to the House of Commons and when Great British Railways is expected to be fully established. I do want to acknowledge and express my appreciation for the engagement of the front bench. Now I want to stress I'm going to be supporting this bill because I believe it represents a critical step in fixing the long-standing issues within our rail system. The current privatised framework has given a fragmented railway, failed to deliver value for money, and efficient service or customer satisfaction. So I'm pleased we're moving towards a model that prioritises the needs of passengers over the profits of shareholders. Rethinking our approach to rail management and financing is a crucial first step towards fixing the foundations and putting Great British Railways at the service of the travelling public.